Hello everyone and welcome to today's workshop. I'm so excited to have you guys all join me so that we can talk about companion planting and spacing. So I'd love it if you can let me know in the chat where you're tuning in from, and if you are watching the replay, then drop that in the comments. It's always so great to see everyone joining in from all around Australia and New Zealand and the world. So to get started today, these are some of the topics that we're going to talk through. And the first one is, what is companion planting? I'm going to go through some of the things that you might have noticed when you're researching companion planting. And then I'm also going to talk about how I do things, because I do things a little bit differently, and I really want to share that with you. And the next thing we're going to talk about is diversity, which is really the key and the secret to the success I have in my gardens. And then I'm also going to share 4 action points so that you have something tangible you can take away with and get started in your own gardens, so that you have something that you can physically see. So we're going to go through those 4 actions, and then we're going to talk about managing spacing. So this is another thing that people get really stuck on, and I get a lot of questions about. So we're going to talk about that, because that is another thing that I don't really follow the rules on. So we're going to talk about spacing and how far apart to plant your vegetables and seedlings. And then I'm going to share some of my ways to grow for abundance. Whether you have a small garden or a large garden, some tips and tricks on how we can get the most food out of the space that we have available. And then we have a takeaway challenge. So this challenge is going to take those 4 actions and put them into work. And I hope that I'm going to be able to see some of your gardens. So there's going to be a little bit of fun to share with other people with that. And then we've got a Q&A. So if you do have any questions, just pop them in the live chat and put a Q at the start, because that way when I go through and have a look at the end of this, I can see which ones are questions and which ones are hello and where you're tuning in from. So that will be really helpful if you can just put that Q at the start of your question. And let's get started. Let's start talking about companion planting. So there's a few different things in terms of companion planting and why we should companion plant. So first up, companion planting is beneficial relationships between different plants so that they can help each other out. And when you are first starting to get into edible gardening, you want to learn all the things. The video cutting out. Hold on. Could be my Wi-Fi having the door shut. Let me know if that improves. I did shut the door to try and reduce some of the noise, but we'll see. So let me know, are you having any more luck with this? So do we have a better connection? Because if not, I will take my camera off and I'll just do it straight through the computer, which might be easier. But companion planting is different relationships between different plants, and they want to be positive relationships. So we want to try and get the best plants that are helping each other rather than, doing any negative things. Is it still buffering? Let me see. I might just switch it off. Let me know if this is any better. I'm just switching cameras, and hopefully we can get rid of that buffering. Just drop it into the chats so that I know if it's any better. I'm streaming this through a new software, so it's a little bit different to normal. But what we're getting is when you first start looking at what companion plants to plant, you'll come across different lists on what plants you should plant next to each other and what plants you should avoid planting next to each other. So much buffering. All right, team, I might see what I can do. I'm not sure why we're getting so much buffering. I may even have to try and put this on through my phone. Oh, the joys of technology. Are we still getting the buffering? Okay, thanks. I'm in my office, so we might be a little bit further away from the Wi-Fi. So I will have to check that out and probably put my Wi-Fi closer to the office. Okay, cool. We're back. So let's start that again in terms of companion planting. So when we start looking into companion planting, you're going to come across a lot of different lists on what you should plant next to each other and what you should avoid. And this was something that I really struggled with when I first started gardening, because I could never remember who liked who didn't like who, and it just got all confusing, and then I didn't end up planting the things. So what I've come up with is a different way of planting and companion planting, and I have found that that works so much better. Okay, so it must have been because I had the door shut. So we'll see if this camera is any better, but all right. So so another thing that companion planting is often used for is for enhancing flavor in your vegetables. So it is something that some plants you plant next to each other, they might help increase or make the flavor better. But from what I've found, there's so many variables that go into the flavor of a plant in terms of how much nutrition is in the soil, how much water the plant is getting, and is it getting the water at the right time, and also the genetics of the seed. So is the seed that you planted from a really tasty, flavorsome plant? That is going to be really determining in the flavor of the plant, and probably not so much on who's planted next to who. So there is some benefits in planting certain plants next to each other that you will eat together, and those are things like your tomatoes and your basil. That is a classic flavor combo that often are planted next to each other because we eat them together. So basil and tomato go really well together in the kitchen. So planting those next to each other can be a really good option. And there's a few other ones in terms of flavors that we eat together. But in the system that I have, there's like so many other plants that we can have that we're going to eat together. So we'll jump into that soon. The other reason that companion planting is great is because it attracts pollinators to our garden. So there's certain flowers that we can plant next to other plants that's going to bring in more of those pollinators to pollinate our fruit and vegetables so we can get bigger and better harvests. So what I do in my garden is that I instead of focusing on companion planting, I focus on diversity. So that is planting a whole bunch of different plants in the same garden. So as you can see in this photo here, I have a whole lot of different things planted in one garden bed, and they are thriving, they are producing a whole lot of food, and the size of the food is still pretty good as well. As you can see from the rainbow chart that I'm holding up, it's not really affecting the size of the plant. So in this garden bed, this is 1.2 meter square garden bed, so it's not very big, it's just over a meter. And I can see in there I've got planted some rainbow chard, some celery, some snapdragons, which are edible flowers, some lettuce, some fennel, and probably a whole bunch of other things. I think even probably some onions I can see in the corner there. So there's a whole range of different plants planted all together, and they all grow well and produce a whole lot of food. So why I think diversity is important is because of these reasons. And planting diversely and having a really mixed garden has just really changed my gardens for the better. And I've also been working on a few other people's gardens and helping out with their gardens, and it has made a dramatic difference in the way that they garden and the way that they're getting food out of their garden and the overall health. Sorry, I'm just getting rid of these. So we have a few different reasons that diversity is so important. So the main one is that it's going to attract lots of beneficial insects to the garden. And you may hear that quite a lot, why it's important to bring beneficial insects into the garden. And that is because they play a really important role in our gardens. So they are going to be eating the some of, like, for example, if you have lots of ladybugs, they're going to eat the aphids, and they can really help with your natural pest management. And then we also have our pollinators, and our pollinators are really important to be bringing into our gardens because they're going to pollinate our fruit and vegetables. So that is mainly our things that flower first, and then become a fruit. So things like your zucchini, watermelon, and pumpkin, they all have male and female flowers, and they need to be pollinated so that they can produce the fruit. So if you are finding that you're struggling with having, for example, a zucchini, and it has a little zucchini and then it shrivels and dies before you're actually getting a chance to eat it, it could be that it's not getting pollinated. And so that is another reason we really want to have as many pollinators in our garden as possible. And the way that we can do that is by having a whole diverse range of different flowers and plants available for them to come and thrive on. So having a diverse range of plants is going to bring a diverse range of insects, which is going to help pollinate all of our plants. And all of our plants aren't pollinated by the exact same thing, and just like all of our flowers don't attract the exact same insect. They all have different preferences on color, on the way that the pollen, like where the pollen is situated in the flower. Some find it easier to get there and some don't. So that's another reason that we really want to have this diverse range. So there is food for everyone. The other thing is that planting diversely is going to reduce our nutrition depletion in the soil. So if you have a patch, and if we have a patch and we plant all the same things in that one patch, then it's going to draw up the exact same nutrients from the soil, and we're going to end up with a garden that is depleted of certain nutrients. And so that's why crop rotation is often talked about, because if you are planting the same thing in the same patch and it's drawing up those same nutrients, and then the soil is depleted, you're going to probably want to plant something different in that patch the following season. Otherwise, it's not going to grow. But if we have this diverse range of plants and planted mixed in together, then we're not going to have that same worry about the nutrition depletion, and we're not going to need to do crop rotation, because we're going to have that range of nutrition still available in the soil. The other thing is that it's going to reduce loss. So if you are planting all the same thing in one patch and a bug finds it and it's like, yes, this is what I love to eat, and it can easily just go from one plant to the next and decimate the whole crop. Whereas if you have things planted diversely and all mixed together, the certain bugs aren't going to like all of the neighboring plants. So you're making it a little bit harder for them to go and eat all of your vegetables. So it can reduce loss in that way. The same as if it's going to reduce loss without having that nutrition depletion. The other thing is it's going to have less diseases. So if there's a certain disease that likes a certain plant and you have all your plants planted together, that disease can easily spread to the other ones, and then you can end up losing entire crop. But if you have your plants planted diversely, and one of your plants gets a certain disease, the neighboring plants may not be affected by that disease at all. So that is going to mean that you're not going to lose your entire garden bed to that certain crop, certain disease. And again, we're talking about promoting soil health. So each of our plants is going to draw up certain nutrients from the soil, but they're also going to excrete some, and they're going to drop leaves, and those leaves are going to go back into the soil as nutrition. So having a diverse range is going to help promote our soil health, and our soil is the absolute key to edible gardens. If you don't have good soil health, it is much harder to grow your fruit and vegetables. So we really want to be taking care of our soil as much as we can. Also, we've got better nutrition. So we're going to have a diverse range of plants available for us to eat. So that is going to give us more of a range of nutrition in all of our meals as well. And if they're going to be healthier plants because they don't have as much disease and they haven't got a nutrition depletion, then that is going to transfer into what we eat as well. Diversity cares for our wildlife in the same way that it's attracting our beneficial insects. Having a diverse range of plants in your garden is going to attract more of a diverse range of wildlife. And I have found a huge amount of diversity in wildlife since I've started gardening this way. I have little lizards, I have birds, these planter boxes here, there's birds all the time coming in and getting any of the little bugs like the snails and things like that. I have little birds that come and do all of the work for me. And it's the same in my food forest style garden. I have lots more wildlife in there since I have different options for them. There's a lot more food available, so there's a lot more wildlife coming. And the last thing is it feels like it's just abundance without force, and that is the way that I like to do all of my gardens. I try and work with nature instead of trying to force it to grow in a way that is unnatural. And if you start to work with nature like that, it just becomes easier, it's less forced, and it ends up being less work in the long run. So a few actions from this to recap. One of the things that you can actually start to do right now is to observe your garden and work out how things are growing, how much shade there is, how much growth and vigor the plants have, and really start to learn about the plants that you have in your garden, because this is going to help you when you're in terms of planting more plants. You're going to know how tall things grow. You're going to know if they are, a low-lying crop. They're probably best to be planted in the corners so they hang over the garden beds or just don't get overshadowed by the things in the middle. And we are going to talk about spacing in a little bit, so we can talk about that, but learning about how big your plants grow and how they react or have relationships with other plants is going to really make it easier moving forward. So learn about your plants and also learn what parts of the plant are edible. This is something that we go through a lot in my membership because I think there's so much left behind in terms of what we eat from our gardens, especially if you are used to buying things from the supermarket. Then there is a huge part of the plant that is often left behind. So when you're growing that in your own garden, you have access to it and you can start to eat it. A lot of people are not realizing that things are edible. So these are, for example, things like your sweet potato leaves. So your kumara leaves are edible. You won't find those in the supermarket. So when you're planting those in your garden, it is often something that people are really surprised that are actually edible. And things like your beetroot and your radishes, all those leaves are edible as well. And the flowers and the leaves on all our brassicas. Those are things that we don't often find when we're purchasing food. So that's something that I think is really important. When you're planting something in your garden, learn what parts of the plant are edible, and that could instantly double the amount of food that you've got growing in one space. So action 1 is to observe your garden. Action 2 is to plant randomly and ditch the straight lines. So this garden here, this is something that I worked on while I was home in New Zealand, and the before photo is my mum's garden, and she planted in patches. So you can kind of see her patches. She's got a patch of beetroot, a patch of parsley, a patch of rhubarb, and she did like to try and do things in straight lines. And she was really struggling with a lot of pests eating her plants. And I sort of just did a takeover, and I went in and I planted a whole lot of edible flowers in between, and we changed the strategy to be a lot more random, which she did find really hard at the start. So if you are used to straight lines, it can be a little bit of a struggle to figure out how to plant randomly, but that is all part of the fun. So as you can see on the after, we popped in lots of edible flowers, and I like to put my edible flowers in the corners and on the sides of the garden bed, as well as in the middle, but a lot of these edible flowers tend to be a little bit smaller and lower in size. So it's a great way to attract pollinators into your garden because they can see them from the sides. They're not overshadowed by the plants in the middle. And that's going to bring in a lot of beneficial insects. And it looks beautiful. She has had a lot of people comment on her gardens and walk through and be inspired to do that in their own garden as well. And I've had messages from other people that have seen my mum's garden and wanted to replicate that or do something similar in their own garden. So she is loving it, and a lot is actually inspiring other people to spend more time in their garden because it looks beautiful and it provides a whole lot of food. So action number 3 is interplant edible flowers. So we talked a lot already about why it's important to have flowers in the garden to attract our beneficial insects, to increase pollination, and also there is other reasons in terms of they provide food for us, and a lot of edible flowers do have medicinal qualities, especially ones like your calendula, and inspire and make an impact. So these gardens that have edible flowers, they look beautiful. They can really inspire other people to start edible gardening as well. And I do think it's really important that they are edible flowers. It is great to have native flowers, and I 100% think it's important to have native plants in your garden design as well. But having edible flowers in your vegetable patch, because you know that they are edible. So if you forget what they are, or you send other people out to your garden to harvest some food for a salad, you know that everything in your vegetable garden patch is edible. And people don't get confused or not know what plants are what and what plants are edible. So that is why I mainly plant edible flowers, because I know that everything in there is edible and it's safe. And a lot of these edible flowers also have edible leaves. So that's another way that we can get some extra greens from our garden, is with our edible plants. And that again comes back to learning about your plants, learning what ones are edible, learning what parts of the plant are edible. And that's going to really maximize, again, how much food you can grow in one space. So we want to interplant with edible flowers, and I do like to put them, as I said, in the corners, and that draws the insects in, and then sort of around the edge if they are smaller plants, or even if they are really tall edible flowers, like I've got hollyhocks, which are really tall. They're amazing for bringing insects into the garden, but they are going to overshadow some other plants. So I will pop those in the corners of my garden bed so they don't overshadow. So that is action number 3 to work on. And then the next thing we're going to talk about is spacing. So spacing and how far apart to plant your plants is something, again, that I get asked quite often about. It's something that really people find difficult. They want to know the exact answer to these things. How far apart do I plant something? What exact plants do I plant next to each other? And the way that I like to garden is just give it a go, try it out, see what works. With my style of gardening, I plant things a lot closer together than recommended on the back of the seed packet. And that is because I can grow a whole lot of different things in one garden bed without having wasted space. So there's a few differences in whether you plant them correctly as per the packet or if you plant them closer together. And one of those main things is the size of the plant may be reduced. So if you plant a cauliflower, for example, or a rainbow chard, they're pretty good. They can grow pretty close together. But if you plant them with the correct amount of spacing as per the packet, you're going to have a bigger chance of getting a full large vegetable out of that plant. If you plant them a little bit closer together, you may end up with a reduced size. So you might get a little bit of a smaller cauliflower, but you're still going to get a delicious cauliflower. And you might have other plants planted next to it that are using up more of that space. And that means you're going to still get a lot of food. So I would rather have a diverse range of a whole lot of different food than have, a garden bed that only has 4 plants in it and I get 4 big cauliflowers. So that's the difference, I guess, in if you plant things with, the correct or giving them enough space to grow or versus planting everything a lot closer together. And it just goes on what you want. Do you want to have the biggest plant, the biggest harvest, or do you want to have a whole bunch of different things all growing together and that you can eat? The other thing is if you do plant things really a little bit too close together. So in some of my gardens, I did have some cauliflowers and they were starting to overshadow some of the smaller plants. I just harvest off those big outer leaves and use those. So that way I get a continuous harvest throughout the whole growing period. By eating those leaves and using them in a stir fry, I'm freeing up some sunlight to some of the plants that I've planted next to it, and I'm also getting food out of it. So it really works well for me in my garden. The next thing is to cover the soil. So covering our soil is really important because we want to protect that soil. If it dries out, it's going to die, and we want our soil to be alive and living because that is what's going to feed our plants. So by planting quite densely, we are going to make sure that our soil is covered. Again, we can use mulch and things like that to help protect our soil. And then some of these plants that we are planting are going to drop leaves, and that's going to be added back into the soil for extra nutrition. So planting densely can really protect the soil. It reduces moisture loss, so you're not going to need to water it as much. It is going to have obviously increased habitat because there's going to be lots more different plants in there for our beneficial insects to thrive. The next thing, which is what we sort of talked about before, was the size may be a bit smaller than our store-bought because if we plant them closer together. But the other thing with the store-bought is if you are buying seedlings from the store and not sowing them as seeds, they can quite often have multiple plants planted in one cell. So this is something that does get a lot of beginner gardeners tripped up on, is that if you buy for example, a 6-pack tray of onions from the store, there'll be many different onion plants in that one little cell. So it's important that we break these up and split them up and put them all throughout our garden rather than planting them all in the one individual cell. And the same if you get some other plants, I don't know what else would come. There's quite a few other plants that will come all planted together in one tiny little cell. And if you plant them like that, they're not going to have enough space to grow. So you think about it in terms of how big is that vegetable. So if we're talking about onions, they're going to be about tennis ball size when they grow. So if you're planting a little cell of, 10 different plants in there, they're not going to have the space to be able to grow and be really much use at all if they're not going to have that space. So break them up and split them out throughout your garden, and just think about them in terms of, an onion is about a tennis ball size, so I'm going to plant them that far apart. I sort of go on a 1 to 2 hand spacing in my garden. I usually put all the bigger plants in first. So if we're talking about cauliflowers and broccolis or tomatoes and zucchinis, they do need quite a bit of space. So I put them in first. And then what I will do is put other little beneficial plants in between. So I'll put in all my edible flowers in between, and then other things like lettuces and greens that I can be harvesting constantly. Another thing that I like to interplant is radishes because they are so quick growing. They're ready to go in, a month. So whilst my other plants are growing, I can use that space that's just sitting empty to grow these really quick growing crops like radishes. And by the time I'm harvesting those, the plant will have plenty of space and it won't have overshadowed the other ones. So that is just how I like to do it in my garden. Obviously, having a lot more plants together, we're going to attract more beneficial insects as well. It's going to reduce weeds because there's not as much access to light on that bottom ground level. So we're going to basically smother out the weeds with food, which is amazing. It's what we want. More food, less weeds. So that's another benefit to planting densely. Obviously, we've got increased diversity, which we've touched on, and increased yields. And that's what I think about it is I would rather have a whole bunch of different things growing than just being able to harvest this one cauliflower in that same space, because once that one cauliflower is gone, I have this whole empty garden bed. So planting diversely gives me a little bit more of a succession, as well as I have a more variety to eat from. So in terms of maintaining the space, I touched on this before, saying that if I have larger vegetables, like you can see in here, I have a cauliflower and it is huge. And some of those bigger leaves are starting to overshadow the other plants. So what I do in this situation is I go through and pick off some of those outer leaves and use those as the plant grows. As you can see, the plant still has plenty of leaves, so it's going to still be able to grow perfectly fine. And then it's going to free up some of that light to get into those other plants. So I just sort of harvest as I go, and that is a lot of extra food that you may not necessarily get if you are purchasing these plants. So that's a win for growing your own food, is you get actually more food for what you're growing. So the other way that I maintain really densely populated gardens is that I will often use liquid feed. So this could be, liquid compost teas, or I make some of my own, fertilizers and compost teas. And by having them in a liquid format, I can easily put that into the garden bed and while it's densely populated, and feed those plants if I think that they need it. Again, at the end of the season, once I've pulled out some of those larger plants, I will put more compost back in, and so I'm making sure that at the end of the season I'm replenishing that soil, because those garden beds only have access to a limited amount of nutrition and soil, so I need to be constantly putting something back in. The other thing that I do is I try to water at the base where I can, because if I'm just overhead watering, that big cauliflower in there is going to stop a lot of that water getting to the other plants. But if I go in and I water just sort of around the base of the plants, I know that they're getting water and it's not just getting lost on the leaves and flowing off the garden onto the grass. So those are just some of the ways that I maintain having a really densely populated garden. So the action that I have for this, for number 4, is to plant densely and use those filler crops. Use crops like edible flowers and radishes to really maximize the space that you have available, and grow whilst you're waiting for your other crops to grow. Another one that's really great is your herbs. They can take up little gaps in between, and herbs can be quite forgiving and don't need so much sunlight. So they are another great one to plant in between, things like your basil and your thyme and parsley. Those are really good ones to plant in between. We're getting there, guys. Soon we're going to have the question and answers. So make sure you're putting those questions in with the Q at the start, because we're going to be answering those very soon. So how to create abundance in the garden. We're going to plant diversity. We're going to plant edible flowers. We're going to do some random planting. We're going to plant densely. We're going to fill in the gaps with our edible flowers and our herbs and our radishes and things like that. And we're going to harvest often. So we're going to continuously be harvesting from our garden a little bit here and there, so that we can make sure there's enough sunlight getting through, and we can eat those leaves as the plant is growing. And we're going to be picking the flowers. So picking the edible flowers means that the plant is going to produce more flowers. So don't be too afraid that you've planted these edible flowers for the insects and then suddenly you're picking them. The more you pick them, the more they'll produce, because they are trying to plant seeds for another generation, or produce seeds for another generation. So if we are picking the flowers before they've had a chance to go to seed, the plant will produce more and more flowers. So don't be afraid to pick them. If you leave them to just go to seed, that the plant will actually stop producing flowers a lot quicker than if you were harvesting them. So make sure you're harvesting your greens, your leaves and your flowers, so that you can get more and more food from that one patch. All right, so next up, we have the challenge. So I'm challenging you to take action on these 4 action points that we've discussed. We're going to observe, we're going to plant randomly, we're going to interplant with edible flowers, and we're going to plant a little bit more densely in our garden beds. So what you can do is choose a garden bed, take some before photos, add some compost, so there's some extra nutrition in there, and then just go to town, planting randomly and densely. You want to make sure that they are edible flowers, so that you know that they're edible, and also any of those filler plants like your radishes and your herbs. And then take some after photos. So you can use the hashtag SH Diversity Challenge, and I would love to see your before and after photos. I think that will be really fun, and we can share those over on Instagram with everyone, because they are going to look amazing. I can just tell. So next up, I just want to touch on, before we jump into the Q&A, I'm just going to touch on my membership, which is the reason that I am hosting this workshop, was to celebrate the launch of my Garden to Plate club, the membership subscription that I'm just so excited about. These monthly workshops and challenges are going to be in there. There's going to be all access to all the recipes that I've made so far, and also the A to Z edible plant directory. So as we touched on earlier, it's important to learn what parts of the plant are edible, and there is so much that is getting left behind in terms of what we have in our garden and what we are actually eating from our garden. So I have PDFs on all of those plants, as well as how to grow, cook and preserve them, and how to save seeds from them or take cuttings to reproduce all of the plants that you have in the garden. So that's just a little bit of an update on that. You can find out heaps of information on the link in the description of this, so I won't go on too much about that. All the info's on my website. If you want to learn more, I would love to have you join me in the club, and there's a really fun community app that we're going to start running these challenges on. So this is a little bit of a sneak peek inside, and you can watch the video that I've just put on my YouTube channel as well for more information. But it is Q&A time. So I'll have a look and see what questions we've got already. But if you do have any other ones, just stick them in the chat now. I have to scroll up. So I hope that was helpful. Let me know if you did learn anything out of that after we got through the buffering, hopefully. The door situation did not work so well. All right, so we've got a question here about cross-pollination. Definitely, that is such a good question. So cross-pollination is going to happen if you have the same sort of plants planted in the same garden. So I don't tend to worry about that so much, because the only time that's going to affect is if you are saving seeds, which I definitely do, but it's not going to affect your current harvest. So if you're planting zucchini and you've got different varieties, you're still going to be able to get all the harvest off those zucchinis. If you are wanting to save seeds from your zucchini, then the seeds could be cross-pollinated, and that means that the next time that you grow them from the seeds, you could get different traits. So it could be that you had a yellow zucchini and you had a striped zucchini, and you could end up with some weird combo of the both of them. So this could mean that you could get some traits that are better and you could get some traits that are worse. So it is going to be a lot more random. You're not going to be so certain of what you're planting, which means you could get mixed results. But because I'm saving seeds just to plant in my own garden, I'm totally okay with that. I'm still going to get food. Those mixed results are still going to produce food. So I'm still saving seeds. I'm still planting things. If I want something that I want to make sure that it's true to type, so if I've got some heirloom seeds and I really want to get those and make sure they're not cross-pollinated, there's a few different ways that I can go about it in terms of only planting that plant and not planting any other varieties at that same place in the same time. So I can stagger the planting so they're flowering at different times so they won't cross-pollinate. Or you can put exclusion bags on them. So just before they're flowering, you can put a little exclusion bag, and that will stop the insects getting in there and pollinating. You are going to have to hand pollinate potentially if it is something like a zucchini. It just depends on what you want out of the situation. If you are wanting to save true to type seeds and make sure that you're getting exactly what you planted, then you're going to have to take some precautions around that. But because I'm just growing food for myself in my own garden, I'm not too worried. I'm still going to get heaps of food, and I'm still going to be able to save seeds that are going to produce more food. So once I get more space, I will be able to do a lot more saving of seeds that are true to type. But for now, I'm just growing all of this food to eat, and I'm quite happy to eat ones that are crossed. Any tips on rhubarb? So I don't personally grow a lot of rhubarb in my garden, but I would be looking it up, seeing if you can see anything under the leaves. Are there any bugs eating it? What's the soil like? It could be that it's lacking a certain nutrient. It could be too waterlogged. There is a real range of different risks. Rhubarb also will die down over winter. Quite a few different varieties will do that. They'll sort of die off over winter and they'll shoot back up in spring. So if it is older leaves, it could be. If you're getting new growth through and it's still looking bad, then that's something you're going to have to do a little bit of research on. It's quite hard to tell from just online. But just have a look at some photos online. You bought cornflowers and calendula. Yay, that's so exciting. I love cornflowers and calendula. They are amazing edible flowers. They attract heaps of pollinators, and we can eat them as well. What are your favorite pollinator ground covers for this type of planting? So there's a few different ones that are, at the moment, I've got some herbs that are flowering at the moment. So those are, I think my thyme is flowering and it's beautiful. Earlier I had some mint that was flowering. There's a few, what would I have? Dianthus is quite low-lying. So a lot of these edible flowers are low-lying, so there are going to be more ground covers. And And I have, I also have a chrysanthemum, a little mini chrysanthemum that has daisy-like flowers. And that is another really good one for having edible flowers and also having pollinators in the garden. And it self-seeds really easy. So I have it all through my garden and it just pops up by itself. Marigolds, those are another one that's really good. When you have a sacrificial plant in your, do I do anything to manage the pest levels or just leave it be completely? So I do have a few sacrificial plants in my garden at the moment, and I will tend to leave them there if they're all eating that one plant and not eating my other ones. Like at the moment I have a kale that is absolutely getting eaten alive, but none of the other plants are getting touched. So I'm leaving that there because if I pull that out, those bugs potentially are going to go to the rest of my garden. If there comes a point where that plant, the bugs are moving on to other plants, then I'll remove it because it's not doing its job and maybe the bugs have run out of food on the sacrificial plant and they're moving off to other places. So at times, especially at this time of year, we're getting a lot of white butterflies, a lot of green caterpillars. And so this is the time of year that I just start to pull out all of my brassicas because those are just attracting heaps of white butterflies. And it's not really worth. They're just taking up space in the garden and they're just getting absolutely eaten. So it's sort of a balancing act there. If the sacrificial plant is working and doing its job, then absolutely leave it. But if your bugs are moving on and eating everything else, then it might be time to take it out. Should we dig up and move root vegetables like carrots, onions? No, definitely leave them. Root vegetables are very sensitive. They don't like having their roots disturbed. So definitely leave them all as they are and enjoy them. And the root vegetables are another one that I really suggest planting as seeds and not buying from the stores because they are going to be all planted together in one little cell, as we were talking about before, and you're going to have to split them up. And the root is the most important part of the root vegetable, and it's also very sensitive. So they don't like being disturbed. So it's actually better to plant seeds directly in the garden rather than buying them in seed trays. But they'll be fine. Like this is just a fun challenge to try in maybe a garden bed that doesn't have as much in it, or that you want to start a new garden bed, because that'll just be a really great way to see and you'll know if this is the style of gardening for you or not. What variety of flowers do you have in your pumpkin patch? Okay, so I have, at the moment, I am putting in some perennials into my pumpkin patch. So I have a artichoke and I'm going to let that go to flower because it has artichokes at the moment. And by the time I'm starting to get pumpkin flowers, the artichoke will be in full bloom and attracting heaps of bees. So I think that's going to be a good partnership there. You want to try and find plants that are flowering at the same time. So that's another way that we can really observe what's going on in our garden and making sure that we are noticing when things are flowering so that we can then plant those next to other things that are flowering. So my pumpkin patch also has those chrysanthemums and they just pop up and regrow every year. They're all flowering now. What else have we got in there? I'm just trying to think. I just did a video with a little bit of an update from that garden, so it should be fresh in my mind. But I think that's probably it as well in that garden. But you could put calendula in there. I've got hollyhocks in there actually, and the hollyhocks are going to probably flower at the same time as my pumpkins as well. And the hollyhocks are edible flowers and they have edible leaves as well. So you can eat the whole plant, which is another win for the hollyhocks. But a squash is bad from cross-pollination as well. I don't actually grow that, but yeah, if you are concerned about cross-pollination and you are saving seeds, it's more about the saving seeds part because it's not going to affect your harvest that you're going to get. So if you've planted squash and you're going to eat those squash this summer and you're going to eat all of them, then it's not going to make a difference. It's only going to make a difference if you're saving seeds from those squash then plant again. So if you are worried about them cross-pollinating, then I would probably still just save seeds and see how it goes anyway. But that's what I love an experiment, so that's what I would do. What else we got? Blueberry questions. Blueberries can be a little bit tricky. There's heaps of different varieties now that can be more suited to your exact climate and growing conditions. So I would just look into your climate and the type of berry that you have and make sure that it's just getting the right amount of sunlight and warmth, because they are quite sensitive to that. Companion plants for grow bag. All right, so something that I would put in a grow bag would be, in winter, it would be like a pansy. Those are really good. They don't take up too much space. Things like dianthus, the mini dianthus, those have quite small plants and they're not going to take up too much room. What else have we got that's small? I do have a whole edible flower beginner guide inside my membership. So if you are a member, you are going to have access to that as well, because edible flowers are obviously really important in our garden. So those are just some ones off the top of my head. Why does Basil hate me? Basil is sassy. I'm not going to lie. I sometimes struggle with basil, but that's why I plant things in different garden beds in different areas, because if they just don't like that spot, it's too hot, it's too cold, it's too shady, the soil's not right, I have more chance of it growing in other areas. So that's why I like to plant things in different areas. It's sort of like insurance as well. So if I'm planting something and I put it all in one spot in one garden bed and it just doesn't like that spot, it's not the right amount of sun or something like that, and they all die, then that's not very economical in terms of the cost for me to plant those and then care for them, and they just die. So that's another reason that I like to plant diversely. It's sort of insurance, because if one dies over there, you've got it in like 5 other spots, and those ones might really take off. What else have we got in here? What manure do you use? I use a range of different manures. I just also always make sure that they are composted first. So you don't want to be putting raw animal manure into your garden, because it has some bacteria and it's also really strong and rich, and it can burn the roots on your plants. So chuck it in your compost first, or purchase or find one that is composted as well, because it can have grass seeds in it. So a lot of these animals are, you want to be using manure from animals that are vegetarian, so that you are reducing the amount of bacteria in the manure. So things like horses that eat grass, those seeds are most likely going to be in the manure. So you want to make sure it's composted so that those seeds are dead first. Otherwise, you're going to end up with all the grass all through your garden, which is not what we want. Do I have any favorites for shady areas? I have a whole video on edible plants to grow in the shade. I think it's like 21 different plants. So definitely it's something that's really important to learn, because you are going to have increased areas of shade in your garden as your plants grow. So if you are growing fruit trees, they're going to increase the amount of shade in your garden. So it's important to find out what plants can handle the shade in your exact climate. So test that out. Check out that video. Sweet potatoes one that I often will plant in the shade. Rainbow chard or silver beet tends to handle quite a bit of shade as well. And because it's such a vigorous growing plant, it's going to grow a little bit slower in the shade, but that's fine if you just plant extra. So that, as well as strawberries. Strawberries are also pretty good, especially the alpine strawberry that can handle a lot of shade. So that's pretty much it for the questions. Thank you guys for joining me. I hope you managed to get some helpful tips out of that. and also I hope you join in on the challenge. So let me know if you're going to do it. I would love to see these before and afters, or just start filling your gardens with edible flowers and some of those fillers, because I think that's going to really help you get a lot more food out of a small space. You're going to attract more pollinators. You're going to have more diversity in your soil, so your plants are going to be healthier. Overall, it's just made a huge difference in the way that I garden, and I've been able to get so much more food out of it. So thank you for joining me. I will hopefully see you all again if we do some more YouTube lives or inside the membership in the club for these monthly workshops. I would love to have you on board. If not, Instagram, YouTube, my website, all the links are in the description, and I will catch you guys all at the next one. Thank you so much for joining.